Hello, I'm Fred Stella, president of the Interfaith Dialogue Association, an affiliate of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. Welcome to another edition of Common Threads. If you've been listening long enough, you know that I have my criticisms of the interfaith movement. Now, the interfaith movement is certainly not monolithic. There are many different expressions of it. But one of the things that I'm always frustrated when I hear in the interfaith environment is if ever there is any form of terrorism or extremism, a lot of interfaith apologists, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, well, all religions have their extremists. And I remember I was at a conference one time, and they had some grand poobah of the interfaith movement as the keynote speaker. And, of course, at some point, that is exactly what he said. And when it came time for questions and answers, I said, excuse me, I disagree with that. I'm going to give you two examples of religions that do not have any form of radical extremism: Jains and Quakers. And he was kind of flummoxed, like, yeah, that is true. Okay, so maybe not every religion has violent extremism in their ranks. And so it occurred to me, I was thinking about that the other day, then I saw a story online about the opening of a Jain temple in the Washington, D.C. area. And I thought to myself, have we ever had a program on Jainism here on Common Threads? And you know, I don't believe we have. I definitely remember trying to get a local Jain to speak here ages ago, maybe something like 20 years ago. And I don't believe that ever happened. Now, with my feeble brain, maybe it did, but I think once every 20 years is the least we can do for what I think is a very noble tradition. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. And our guest is Monica Shah. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Monica was born and raised right here in Michigan in a family where community service, especially within the Jain community, was deeply held as a value. She studied engineering at the University of Michigan and lived in Chicago and Seattle before settling in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Monica is passionate about building a strong Jain foundation for the next generation, driven by her belief in the importance of overcoming inner enemies such as anger, ego, pride, and deceit. This guiding philosophy has shaped both her personal and professional life. She's served as a Jain teacher for children ages 3 to 15 and spent 7 years as the Director of Education for the Jain Society of Metropolitan, Washington. Under her leadership, the community has seen exciting growth, a stronger sense of connection, and the successful launch of several new programs. Professionally, Monica is an executive in the federal government, focused on cybersecurity. Outside of work, she enjoys traveling and seeing the world with her husband and 2 children. So we welcome to Common Threads, Monica Shah. Hi, Monica.
Hi, Fred. Thank you so much for inviting me today.
Certainly. So before we get into a great depth of Jainism as a religion, tell us a little bit about yourself and about growing up in a major metropolitan area where even though it is a major metropolitan and very urbane area, I'm suspecting that a lot of people, especially when you were growing up with other kids, did not know that Jainism even really existed. Tell us what that was like. Did you have to do a lot of education as a young kid, as a young adult? And what was the atmosphere like in your social circle?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, actually. So one of the first things I always highlight when I introduce myself and my practices in Jainism is that I'm first generation American. So I'm born and raised in this country, and my parents immigrated here. And not to age myself too much, but growing up in the 80s and 90s, I think simple practices like diversity and awareness of other cultures wasn't as affluent as it is today. And I remember one of the big things that stands out is as Jains, we definitely practice nonviolence to the most extent possible. And by doing so, we generally have a vegetarian diet. And so in elementary school, with my parents being immigrants to this country and trying to figure out what to feed me for lunch every day, which is a problem that I still face with my children. Um, I often had just peanut butter jelly sandwiches. And that was the first time that I really noticed a difference between my peers and I, where I didn't eat meat and I didn't have like a ham and cheese sandwich or I didn't have chicken nuggets. And that was actually one of the surface things that really made me feel different. Um, and I think back then it was, vegetarianism, veganism was definitely not as common by any means. And that was kind of the biggest highlight for me. As I got older and, I went to university, um, I found myself just fitting in other areas, whether it was interest in sports or pop music or fashion or travel, right? And I tend to just gravitate towards people with similar likings in those fields. And it wasn't, I seeing myself as a Jane didn't really come out in my social circles when I was in school. I think that one thing I would point out is that my Jain friends were all my Indian friends. And so there was a part of me that had an Indian friend circle, and then, my peers from school and my friends from like basketball and tennis and things like that.
How about when you talk about your social circle? You mentioned you had a number of Jain friends. What about Hindus and Sikhs?
Yeah, yeah. So there was definitely, and I think this is common with a lot of immigrants that come and try to settle here. They tend to gravitate towards things that are familiar to them or things that where they can kind of hold on to their roots and their cultures. So there was an Indian community in Detroit metro area, and there still is today. And most major metropolitan cities in the US will have some sort of Indian community. And those communities will get together for social things or festivals, whether it's, a Diwali celebration or a summer picnic. And within those Indian communities, there might be smaller communities that are also set up. So we were a part of the, I would say, Gujarati community. There were, a Gujarati organization that celebrated Gujarati festivals and had Gujarati gatherings socially, as well as a smaller community that was a Jain community. So there were a lot of Jains that were also a part of the Gujarati community. And so I had friends amongst Jains and amongst Gujaratis. I didn't know too many people that were Indian, were of Indian descent that didn't fall into one of those two categories, just because they weren't part of the social circles that we were engaging in.
That's interesting. That brings up a point. Now, some people may not know this, but sometimes you can kind of sort of tell there's a relationship between regions in India and religions. So, for instance, and we've explored Sikhism here on Common Threads, and many Sikhs, not all of them, but many of them come from the Punjab area. Um, and I was not aware, but are you telling me that Gujarat, which is a western state in India, are you telling me that there is a significant Jain population there that you might not find, say, in Bengal or uh, Tamil Nadu?
Yes, I believe that is true. A lot of Gujaratis, or I should say, a lot of Jains are Gujarati. Um, I would just be throwing out a number like 80%, but that's not, don't quote me on that. That's just to give you an understanding that most Jains are Gujarati. There are a lot of Hindi speaking Jains. There are a lot of Jains coming from Rajasthan area. There are some Jains here from South India as well. So by no means is it an absolute, but a lot of Jains are Gujarati.
And can you tell us historically why does that make sense?
Uh, I couldn't tell you. No, I'm sorry. I do not know the history as well as I would feel comfortable answering
No, 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 no.
on a
That's
radio show program.
no that's perfectly fine. That's perfect. But clearly you will find Jains in virtually any area in India. But you're telling us the west coast, the state of Gujarat is a very significant hub of Jain activity.
Yes.
Okay. And tell us this, and we will get into the specifics of Jain philosophy and theology in just a moment. But when you were growing up and even into adulthood, were you identified by other people, not by yourself or your family, but by other people as being Hindu?
Um, I I think that may have been an assumption, and um, just because Jainism is not very well known, and most Indians are Hindu, so when you identify as an Indian, I think it's easy for people to make that assumption that, oh, you must be Hindu.
Right,
But
right.
I don't remember like religion being a big topic when I grew up, right? Like I don't remember really talking about what's my faith, or especially like in elementary school or middle school. I do remember sometimes kids asking me like, have you been baptized, right? Um but I don't really remember, and maybe that was also because I didn't share, right? Like it wasn't something that I openly talked about because, again, when you're being raised from an immigrant household, you're trying to acclimate into the culture that you're in.
Of course. And how about now as an adult? Uh, I'm not talking about you personally, but you as a member of the community, or rather, speaking right now for the community. Is there a constant um, understanding or a constant repetition of no, we're not Hindu because the general community tends to think of you as Hindu, and of course, many Hindu temples accommodate Jains by having a Jain altar. So I see the opportunity for confusion to sometimes barge in.
Yeah, I see your point. I think that when I'm engaging with Indian people, I can identify myself as Jain, and I don't think that assumption is as easily made because India is so diverse and there's just so many cultures and religions and languages, right? That I don't think Indians tend to make assumptions about other Indians. When I engage with non-Indians, um, again, I feel like religion just doesn't really come up. So if they're making an assumption about my religious background, I wouldn't know about it. I wouldn't be phased by it.
I understand. I want to remind people if you're just joining us, you're listening to Common Threads. My name is Fred Stella, and with me today is Monica Shah. And we are discussing Jainism. Monica is with the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington. And you're listening to WGVU FM. Okay, so let's dive in to the religion itself. Uh, how far back does Jainism go? I believe I recall that the founder of Jainism and the founder of Buddhism were not too far apart in eras. Is that correct?
Yeah, I have heard some some of the history of that. I think Jainism, when we're taught about Jainism, there's no beginning to time and there's no end to time. End is cyclical, and so Jainism was kind of always there. Now, if you could go back in the history and kind of identify, like, when were the first saints. Each Jain, um, each cycle in Jainism has 24 main saints. And so there's history and dates of when these saints were um, around and when they were preaching. But I think Jainism, and let me know, Fred, if I'm going on a tangent here, but I think Jainism is much more of a philosophy and a way of thinking, as opposed to what you may traditionally think of as a religion where, and I say that because when we look at our saints, we're not necessarily praying to them to ask for things, or we may not be seeking something from what we would call these saints. We're more of admiring their values and their goals, and trying to achieve that within ourselves. And so it is a very internal philosophy of how you want to live your life. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why Jainism isn't um, so well known, because it is such an introverted religion, if that makes sense.
Right, exactly. You don't go looking for converts, which I think all of the what are termed the dharmic religions or paths, you share that with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism, right? That you keep to a fairly closed community. You're not unwelcoming to new people entering in, right? But you don't go encouraging people necessarily to join the fold, right?
Yeah, because it is very much to each its own, in the sense that we Jains believe that you are the master of your own destiny and your own soul, and you have to take care of yourself.
Right, right. I understand that. So tell us about Mahavir. He is known as the founder of Jainism, although I understand you may disagree with that because you've just said Jainism goes back much further, if you will, than the establishment of a tradition by one particular person. But if you're going to take a course on Asian religions, you're probably going to hear that Mahavir is the founder, correct?
Yeah, that wouldn't be it wouldn't be a surprise to hear that. Mahavir is the 24th saint, and so he is the last saint of this cycle. And I'm using the word saint here, and I'm not even sure if that's the right word, because in Jainism, we don't necessarily believe in gods the way other religions have characterized gods. So Jains don't believe there's a creator or a destroyer. Jains don't believe that um, gods can give us anything. Jains believe that a soul can break the cycle of life and death, and a soul is continuously in the cycle of reincarnation. And those souls that break the cycle of life and death attain full liberation. And so Homavir is the, you know, soul, the 24th saint that, reached liberation. Now, there are thousands and thousands of souls that have reached liberation, but the reason why they're 24 are kind of called out, as opposed to all the other thousands that have reached liberation, is because these 24 not only um, reached liberation, but they also um, provided a lot of guidance to the human race in terms of how to practice Jainism, and why one would want to break the cycle of life and death, and why one would want to be liberated, and what true happiness is, right? So there's a distinction between these 24 versus other souls that have also attained liberation. And
Right, and Mahavir was really the one who uh, made it public, if you will, to say, hey, you know what? Before me, there were these 23 others who were great saints rishis, whatever you want to call them, and I am continuing this tradition. Is that fair to say?
I think so. Yes, yes, it is fair.
It actually reminds me, I don't know how much you know about Islam, but there's something similar. If you go up to the average person, even somebody well educated in world's religions, and say, who is the founder of Islam? They're going to say Muhammad. But Muhammad would say, well, no, Islam has always been around, and Adam perhaps was the first prophet. So, he retroactively initiated all of these other people, the figures from the Judeo-Christian tradition of saying, no, they were Muslim too. But nobody heard of Islam until I came along and told you that these people were. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, it is similar in that sense.
Right, right. So you have... we'll call them temples. Is there another word? Is there a Gujarati or Sanskrit word for temple that you would use as opposed to what, say, a Hindu might? A Hindu would say, "I go to a mandir." A Sikh would say, "I go to a gurdwara." Where does a Jain go?
The Jains would call it a derasar. Derasar.
Derasa. Okay, thank you. And what would be a form of what in the West we would call it worship? Is there a better word to describe what goes on? Because it sounds to me like you do not have an object of worship, if you will, but obviously you must do something when you go to these centers.
Yeah, so all Jain temples will have an idol of one of the 24 saints, if not multiple idols. So you mentioned Washington, D.C., that has a new Jain temple. So um, there are multiple idols in the new Jain Derasar there. And when someone goes to the temple, there are different things people will do. Sometimes people will go just to meditate and take some time for themselves. There are certain rituals that can be performed. And when those rituals are performed, they're called puja. Those rituals or those pujas are, a time for an individual to remind themselves of the qualities that the saints have achieved, and trying to embrace those qualities and kind of incorporate those into their day-to-day lives, right? So that is the main objective for when we go to the temple. It's to kind of reset ourselves and to remind us of, like, what's the bigger picture here? What do we really want to attain out of this life? It's a precious gift to be born as a human. What do I want to take from this? And that's kind of the mindset that people will go in when they go to the temple. It is, I will say that one thing about the Jain temple as well is that there's etiquette, right? When you walk into a Jain temple, like, you don't want to have your cell phone ringing, you want to wear modest clothes, there's common cultural etiquette. But when you go into the temple, there is, like, to each its own, right? People can do as they want. Some people may want to sit in the back and do something. Some people may want to perform a puja. Some people may, just want to take a quick glimpse and walk out. Some people may not even want to go in, right? So there aren't that many, like, you must do something when you go into a temple.
No, I understand that. And it does sound actually very similar to my experiences going to a Hindu temple, where a lot of different things can be going on simultaneously. And for a lot of Westerners, and I'll agree, the first time I went to one, I thought, oh, wait a minute, these guys are doing this over here, and these other people are doing this over here. Why don't they just all get together and do the same thing? Because, that's what you see in virtually every other house of worship, is people joining together as a congregation. But clearly this is not the case, as you say, in Jainism. Monica, we are coming down to the end of this particular episode, but before we leave, just tell us a little bit, while people who are listening to us on WGVU, this might not benefit them, but people who are going to be listening to the podcast version of this show, tell us a little bit about where the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington is and how they can access information.
Yeah, sure. So our website is www.JSMW, and that stands for Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington. So it's just the first letters, jsmw.org. And that website will give you all the information about, where the temple is located, opening hours, and even contact information if you wanted to get more information or talk with anyone or visit.
Wonderful.
So the website would be the main place I'd point people to. And it's
Yes.
I'll also add, so it's right outside the 495 Beltway, conveniently located where I-95 and 495 intersect. So it's in Beltsville in Maryland, right outside the Beltway.
Very good. Wonderful. Well, Monica, I still have many more questions for you, and I'm hoping you'll agree to join us next week and we can continue this.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. It's a pleasure.
You're listening to WGVU. I'm Fred Stella, and with me today has been Monica Shah. She's with the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington, and we will be talking to her again next week right here on Common Threads. Hello, I'm Fred Stella, president of the Interfaith Dialogue Association. Welcome to another edition of Common Threads. Recently, it occurred to me that we may have never done a program exploring Jainism. If we did, because remember, we've been having this program now for almost 30 years. And if we did do something, it was probably over 20, 25 years ago on Jainism. So this is a program on exactly that. If you're not familiar, Jainism is a religion that comes to us from India. And we have with us Monica Shah from the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington. And let me tell you a little bit about Monica, who was with us last week. Monica was born and raised in Michigan in a family where community service, especially within the Jain community, was a deeply held value. She studied engineering at the University of Michigan and lived in Chicago and Seattle before settling in the Washington, D.C. metro area. She has served as a Jain teacher for children ages 3 to 15 and spent 7 years as the Director of Education for the aforementioned Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington. Under her leadership, the community has seen exciting growth, a stronger sense of connection, and the successful launch of several new programs. Professionally, Monica is an executive in the federal government focused on cybersecurity. Outside of work, she enjoys traveling and seeing the world with her husband and 2 children. So we welcome once again to Common Threads, Monica Shah. Hi, Monica.
Hi, Fred. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, certainly. So last week we wound things up, as I recall, talking a little bit about what people in the West might refer to as temple worship. And I want to explore that a little bit. When people go to the temple, last week you said that multiple activities can be going on simultaneously, that some people may be involved in a ceremony that you refer to as pujas. It could be somebody is simply meditating. It could be that someone is engaged in some other activity, and there is no encouragement, if you will, for everybody to be doing everything simultaneously, as we often see in Christian, Jewish, Muslim, in mosques, synagogues, and churches. And You mentioned pujas, the ceremonies, and I'm curious, do you have people who are, again, I'm using Western words that may not fit 100%, someone who has been ordained to do such activities? Or is this something that one learns as a practicing Jain to do oneself? How does that work?
Yeah, so both actually. Because uh, because of our lifestyle here in the States, right, where we, are going to work 5 days a week, and we have obligations to take care of our home and our families, um, we generally consider ourselves lay practitioners, excuse me, in the sense that we're not, the general Jain population is not going to the temple every single day. um, and it's mainly because of our lifestyle here. And for example, I live in Virginia, and my the temple is in Maryland. Um, that being said, individuals definitely have the opportunity to learn the puja rituals, and are encouraged to, if they have that interest, and can practice those rituals themselves when they go to the temple, following the right etiquette. You want to have clean clothes, and you want to understand the rituals to be able to perform them properly. In addition, we do have what's called a pujari. Um, and I guess, to give an example, maybe it's similar to what you may think of as like a clergyman or something. But the pujari lives on site, and he conducts puja every single day. And that's something that, we as Jains will do for our idol, is have puja conducted every single day. And so we have a pujari on site that takes care of our temple, and conducts the rituals every single day. And in addition, the laymen, the lay Jains, who are welcomed and encouraged to participate as much as they can, whether that's daily or weekly, or once a month, or maybe on their birthday, right? Like, people tend to exercise their interest differently.
Another thing you mentioned last week, and again, we still need to get into the deeper philosophy of Jainism, which we'll do in just a minute. But you mentioned that you don't have a concept of gods and goddesses or a creator God. And I neglected to mention, I think I mentioned it last week, but I didn't mention it earlier just now. The whole reason I was sparked to make contact with the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington is because I saw an article online about the dedication of your temple, and there were pictures there, and in the temple there was a picture of Lakshmi, who is the Hindu goddess of prosperity, and I'm curious, how did she get in there? Are
Yeah.
you do you know the picture I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah, I think I do. I guess Jains, they definitely believe, every living thing has a soul, and every soul has a right to eternal happiness. And every soul has the ability to attain eternal happiness. Now, we believe in reincarnation, and we believe in, as a human right now, I will take birth as another being in my next life. We do believe in a heaven and a hell. And so we do believe that Lakshmi Devi is a Devi in the heavens. And there are hundreds, thousands of Devis and Devs in the heavens and in the hells. And they are also going through that cycle of life and death. And so at some point, it might be thousands of years or millions of years, but we will believe that their soul's journey will continue until it reaches liberation.
I see. That makes sense. Um, Now, so you mentioned that there are heavens and hells. Are they, the heavens and hells? Are they temporary or are they eternal? Let me
Yeah,
rephrase that.
I want I want to say they're eternal, just like time is, right? Like it never ends, it never
But
begins.
okay, I'm going to rephrase that. If my soul goes to hell tomorrow, is that soul going to be there for eternity?
No,
So,
no.
okay.
You will constantly be in this cycle of life and death. You're the only way you can break out of that cycle is if you get liberated.
Yes. So someone,
So,
yes.
yeah, the state of being in heaven or being in hell is not a state of liberation. That is just another place your soul is going.
Understand. And so then what you're saying is ultimately when liberation happens, heaven and hell are transcended, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Can you talk about that final experience? Is there a word for it? Because obviously most people in the West, they would believe, if they believe in heaven and hell, they're going to believe that once you're in hell, you're in hell, and once you're in heaven, you're in heaven. And heaven, there's no other greater place to be. But you're saying that in fact there is.
Yes, in Jainism, we believe that liberation is the ultimate state. We believe that when a soul is liberated, a soul is fully omniscient, right? They know everything. A soul is with one with everything, so it's everywhere. And a soul is, you know, eternal bliss. Like it's like a state of being where there is nothing obstructing you, there is nothing blocking that soul. That soul is, full energy, full power, full knowledge, full bliss, full everything, and it's with everything.
Yes. So I'm getting the impression that um, if you speak to a lot of people from especially the Abrahamic faiths, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, when they try to cognize the final experience, the final joyous experience, assuming that heaven is the destination, heaven is kind of like an earthly experience but perfected, where there is no pain, where there is no sadness, but at the same time they inhabit some form of body and they go through human experiences. They have relationships with other human beings, etc. This is not that, from what I'm gathering, right? This is not that. You're not having a human experience. You're simply existing as uh, pure joy, pure thought, pure consciousness. Am I in the right track?
Yeah. Yes, I think you're characterizing it well.
Okay, okay. Uh, Something we just touched on a little bit last week, and I want to get more into it because this is what you are known for. If you were a company, this would be your brand, and that is ahimsa, nonviolence. Um, and you talked last week about simply being a vegetarian and sometimes feeling a little bit awkward because you might be the only vegetarian in a particular certain circle of friends at school or whatnot. But talk about the importance and specifically how you express nonviolence, because from what I understand, it's not just refraining from hitting people or shooting people. It goes much deeper than that.
Yeah, yeah. So we try to practice ahimsa, nonviolence, with our actions, our words, and our thoughts. And the belief is that when you commit violence in any of those forms, you are attaining karma. And that karma is what's weighing your soul down and keeping your soul in that cycle of life and death. So the goal is to minimize your karma, to shed your karma. And to do that, you practice nonviolence. And so when we say through our actions, our words, and our thoughts, the actions is very easy to see. It's tangible. It's vegetarianism is one of the most noticeable things, even amongst Indians. And we talked a little bit about this last week about Indians identifying me as Jain. If I said I was vegetarian, it would there have been many times where an Indian person has said, "Oh, are you Jain?" Right? So that's how much of vegetarianism is an identifying factor for us. Um, but I think as we get educated, we tend to practice that ahimsa with our actions a little bit more, in the sense of being more conscious with the products we buy, right? We tend not to wear leather goods. We tend to be a little bit more conscious of, like, even our toiletries, and just making sure that things like that do not have animal byproducts. With our words, I think that's pretty intuitive, not having any abusive language towards others. I think where we have the most, where ahimsa is kind of the strongest, is actually within our minds. And I we Jains believe that when you exercise negative emotions, or what I called inner enemies, like anger or greed, that that activity is also acquiring karma. And so we really believe that, if you minimize your anger, your greed, your pride, your deceit, you will be minimizing the amount of karma, the amount of inflow of karma into your soul. And as a believing Jain, like, okay, I got it. That makes sense to me. But when I think about, I have two kids who are second generation Americans, who are more acclimated into today's culture than I was myself. Um, I talk to them about these negative emotions, and at the end of the day, it makes sense whether you're Jane or not, but it makes sense on just your overall, like, happiness, right? And so I'm really just a big proponent of, like, hey, we really need to get our emotions in check. It's going to make us happier. And by the way, it's going to have less karmic inflow. So that's kind of really the thought behind ahimsa, is really kind of minimizing the violence to ourselves.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Common Threads. My name is Fred Stella, and with me today is Monica Shah. She is with the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington, and we are discussing, well, quite obviously, Jainism. Another thing, too, that I notice, I mean, when you say you're vegetarian, okay, there are vegetarians and there are vegetarians. I remember, I think it was the first Indian wedding I attended, and both the bride and groom were Hindu. But I go to the reception and I see this fabulous buffet, which I make a dive for, and then I look around, and on the other side of the room I see another buffet, but this one has a sign that says Jain table. And it is a little bit different from the table that I originally visited, or perhaps a better word would be attacked. So tell us what you might find on a Jain table, or what you might not find on a Jain table that you would find on another table that was, of course, vegetarian. The Hindu table, or the everybody else table, was strictly vegetarian. But the Jain table went a little further. Tell us what you might not find on a Jain table.
Yeah, yeah. So, I- yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. There's vegetarians and then there's vegetarians. Um, so at the Jain table, you generally wouldn't see any rooted vegetables. So you wouldn't see things like onions, garlic, carrots, potatoes, beets, turnips, right? Anything that where you have to pull out the entire root to eat that plant um, would not be on a Jain table. Um, Jains tend to focus their diet on lentils, grains, even certain fruits, like very, very strict. Like Jains may not eat certain fruits during certain seasons, just because of all of the added violence that happens to the environment to acquire some of these goods, right? And so, like in the monsoon season, for as an example, in India, um, there's a lot of hardship that happens on the environment. So Jains tend to really, really minimize um, eating with the mindset that, hey, I'm eating to nourish this body, but my I am not my body, right? Like my soul and my body are two different things. And our Jain ascetics will have an even more um a strict diet, like they'll only drink boiled water. They'll only eat food that has already been cooked for another person. Like they won't want additional food cooked for them because of the extra work that's involved. And again, just really trying to minimize their footprint and really trying to distinguish that the difference between, hey, this is my body, I need to nourish it to keep it going. But I'm my soul, and my soul is different.
I remember last week I began the show by talking about how there's this trope in some circles whenever an act of terrorism is being committed for a religious purpose, that some people are always saying, "Oh, well, there's extremism in every religion," and I maintain that, well, not in Jainism, and not in some others as well. But however, I think I can point to what some people would call extremism, although we're not talking about violence, we're not talking about terrorism. It's simply an extreme way to live. And one of the ways that I see, I certainly don't see it here in the United States, but I see in India where you have people who wear very little clothes, but they wear a face mask and they push a broom in front of themselves wherever they go. I'm assuming you have been to India and you have seen this example. Am I correct?
Oh yeah, definitely. Though,
And
and those are, you're referring to Jain aesthetics. So those individuals have taken vows to let go of the material world and to let go of their day-to-day comforts and to really focus on their inner self. And that's a big distinction between Jain aesthetics who have taken those additional vows to focus on their souls, as opposed to a layperson like me who goes to work every day in my gasoline fueled car and comes home and is cooking a lot of food and may not have leftovers that I'm chucking out, right? Like there's a big difference between the life path that they've chosen and the life path that I'm living today.
yes, yes, and also something you will find in India that I've never seen here is that some of those people, again, oftentimes when I've seen video or film of these people who would you call them monks?
Yeah, I mean, you can call them monk. We
Okay,
the term we use is sadhu
sadhu,
for a
sure.
male and sadhvi for a female.
Okay, so you would see these sadhus, many of them rather scantily clad, And then there are also those who wear nothing at all. I believe they're called sky clad. And in India, it's perfectly acceptable. I don't know how things would go over here with people walking around virtually naked, but they do it not out of any sense of immodesty, correct? They are doing it because they want to be freed from every possible attachment, including the attachment to be covered, to actually own a piece of cloth, correct?
Yeah, that's true. In Jainism there are different sects, so different sects will have different ways to practice their non-attachments. But I think, to be fair, like India is so um diverse and so modern, and so when these aesthetics are practicing their non-attachment lifestyle, and when they're exercising these additional vows, they tend to stay in communities where that is kind of known and supported, right? So as an example, you're not going to see a Jain monk walking in the middle of Mumbai, right, where there's a Starbucks and there's a nightclub, right?
Right.
Because that the community there is not going to be able to support and sustain that lifestyle. So they're going to be more in rural areas. They're going to be where there's a Jain temple. There's going to be where there's a lot more Jains living, so they can get food. And so, yes, you'll see that in India, but it's also like where the community is kind of supporting that.
Sure. That's a very important point. You're right. Not just walking down the middle of a main street in Mumbai or in Bengal, in Calcutta or something. I get that. That's very important. So, Monica, we are down to the wire for this episode of Common Threads, and I'm going to ask you the same thing that I did last week, in case anybody missed that. If for people who may be listening to the podcast version of this conversation in the Washington, D.C. area or the Mid-Atlantic region, tell us how they can get in contact with the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington.
Yeah, sure. So the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington, we just built a brand new temple, and it is located at the intersection of 495, the Beltway, and I-95, and it is in Maryland, Beltsville, Maryland. Our website is really great. It has a lot of information in terms of address and hours to visit and people to contact. And so I would encourage you to definitely check out the website. It's www.JSMW, and that stands for Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington, jsmw.org.
Wonderful. Do you get a fair amount of visitors?
We actually get a lot of visitors out of state. So, like the Jains in New Jersey may decide to take a road trip and visit the new temple, or the Jains from North Carolina may decide to take a road trip. We don't get that many visitors from non-Jains simply because a lot of people just don't know that much about Jainism.
I would guess that once the schools find out about you, colleges, that you may be getting more. Okay, we are closing this episode. So, Monica, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me. Thank you so much.
This is Common Threads you've been listening to with Monica Shah from the Jain Society of Metropolitan Washington. My name is Fred Stella, and please join us again next week here on WGVU FM.